It's The Real News. I'm Aaron Mate. To deal with the jarring reality of Donald Trump's presidency, many people have turned to mindfulness practices like yoga and meditation. These practices have been used to ease stress induced by Trump in the White House and to promote calm during very uncertain times. Well, my next guest argues that mindfulness meditation, especially, can be used as a weapon against Trump and his allies and help overcome some of the ways in which the self-proclaimed resistance may fall short. Robert Wright is a visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He is author of several best-selling books, including his latest, Why Buddhism is True, The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment. In part one, we discussed the book, and now in part two, we're going to discuss what Wright calls mindful resistance, which also is the name of a website that he has founded. Welcome, Robert. How can mindful resistance help us take on Trump?
Well, I think, first of all, my premise is that what we call the resistance, the opposition to Trump, for starters, sometimes suffers from excessive reactivity. I guess you might think, you might say that there's overreaction to some of the things he does, which doesn't mean the things that he does aren't bad. They're very bad. It's just that I think sometimes his goal is to elicit a strong reaction, because a strong reaction from his opponents, in some cases at least, kind of reinforces the narrative that he has going with his base. I mean, the narrative being that, all of these like liberals and coastal elites have contempt for ordinary Americans, and they have contempt for Trump. That the media is biased and takes every opportunity to present him in the least favorable light, and so on. So I think one big reason to not overreact to Trump is you want to be careful and not play into his hands and just fall for every provocation. Another reason is that it's distracting. I mean, there's real work to be done. I think it's important to figure out, what was it that allowed him to get as many votes as he got, even though, of course, he didn't get a majority of the votes, but still, he got enough. What was the source of his appeal? Are there, obviously there's some just bad people who supported him, some racists and so on. I'm convinced that's not the whole story, that it's more complicated than that different people supported him for different reasons. And I think it's important to figure out why, and when possible, when these people had valid grievances about the way they were being treated by the political system, to address those, and so offer an alternative to Trump. And I think there are really big, important issues of policy raised by the kind of attitude of voters who supported Trump. So that's a couple of the reasons that I think sometimes, at least, the resistance to Trump needs to be a little less reactive and more reflective.
Right. In this respect, I think the resistance is a very apt term, because it also is a term in psychoanalysis, right? When someone has resistance subconsciously to something, it's because they perhaps see a threat to their own ego and to something actually in them that they see reflected back, which they don't want to look at. And so instead of acting with an open mind and with compassion, they act with sort of a very quick defensive wall. And I think in some of the ways in which the resistance has responded to Trump, by blaming Russia for him being elected, by maligning those who voted for him and ignoring their concerns, as you point out, the resistance is in fact displaying a form of psychoanalytical resistance. I'm wondering if you agree.
Yeah, and it isn't just that. I mean, you're right. Once you feel threatened by anything, all kinds of things are set in motion that may obscure your vision. And I do want to emphasize the obscuring your vision part. I mean, you mentioned the issue. I forget if you used the word compassion, but the idea that there are impediments to kind of empathizing with Trump voters once you see Trump as this big threat, which he certainly in a sense is. But I think the problem goes beyond that. I mean, I think you're right that we don't, easily kind of feel the pain of Trump supporters. But in addition to this lack of like what is sometimes called emotional empathy, there's there are impediments to cognitive empathy, by which I mean just understanding what their perspective is, understanding the way they see the world. It's called perspective taking sometimes, and I think that kind of empathy is also impeded, and I think in a way that's more important than the emotional empathy. I mean, even I don't think it's so important that you actually feel their pain and spend a lot of time doing that. I do think it's very important that you understand where they're coming from, why they see the world the way they do. And we know now from modern psychology that when you see a group as the enemy, there are some cognitive biases set in motion that keep you actually that are oddly almost designed by natural selection to keep you from sizing them up in an objective and clear-eyed way. As it happens, mindfulness meditation can I think help clarify your vision. But even if you don't meditate, I think there's still the case for just making an effort to view the situation mindfully, as calmly and as reflectively as possible.
I have a concern that comes up for me when I hear some Buddhist teachers try to analyze politics, which is that their commitment to compassion for everybody and their commitment to equanimity on all sides might sort of water down their political analysis. So, for example, whereas there'd be no equivocation if they were to look at the Nazi Holocaust, on other issues they might see parity where it's not there. And so I want to give you one example, which is that I heard a very famous and very wise Buddhist teacher, someone who I really value, say about the Israel-Palestine conflict that if only both sides could just come together and listen to each other, then the problem could be solved, which I found to be very naive because as I see that conflict, it's a case of an occupied people confronting an occupier, a military occupier. Of course, there's complexities to it, but that to me is what it is at its core. So I'm wondering your thoughts if there's a risk sometimes of how the pursuit of compassion, of balance, of not being accusatory, not being self-righteous, can sometimes weaken our ability to see things clearly.
It can in principle, but I would say that the kind of compassion that ideally you cultivate through Buddhist practice has a kind of almost objectivity to it. In other words, it's not the kind of emotional investment that leads a parent to despise the rivals of his or her daughter or son. And in theory, it can help you understand both sides better. I mean, as far as Israel-Palestine goes, I agree it's an occupation, and America shouldn't be supporting it as uncritically as it is. On the other hand, it's important to understand. I've been to Israel. I've been to the West Bank. The Israelis are genuinely fearful for their security. They're not like just saying that so they can oppress people. That's their big issue. And they think that if they give an inch, I mean, I think they're mistaken. I think what they're doing is bad for their security in the long run, but they genuinely think that they can't afford to give an inch. And I think it's important to understand both sides. Mindfulness meditation, it's hard to convey to people who haven't done it, but when it works, I think it gives you, in principle, a compassion for all people that doesn't involve the kind of intense attachment that keeps you from having a kind of a global perspective on actually solving the problem.
And I don't disagree, I guess, and I don't want to get too political here because it's not the purpose of this discussion for us to debate Israel-Palestine, but my concern is that in this attempt to understand both sides might establish more parity than there actually is. And if it's a situation where you have an occupier and an occupied people, then, from my point of view, I don't really care so much about what the occupied side feels or thinks. I mean, I understand it's important to hear them and to not dismiss anybody, but I'm just concerned about in this attempt to understand everyone's feelings, that we establish a parity that is not fair to the situation?
Well, one thing I'd emphasize is that when you try to explain someone's behavior, you're not excusing it. Okay, you're not saying, well, then whatever they do is defensible. Now that we understand it and understand that even we might behave like them in a similar situation, well then, okay, we'll have to accept it. That's a common human intuition, that to explain something is to excuse it. But I think I have to, emphasize that that's not the deal. That in my view, first you try to understand the situation, which involves coming to the clearest possible understanding of why everyone did everything, and then you try to solve the problem. I mean, I certainly, I certainly think that the Palestinian perspective just does not penetrate American consciousness the way the Israeli perspective does. And that's part of the problem in terms of America's policy. But that doesn't mean that there's not an Israeli perspective, the understanding of which could actually facilitate a solution to the problem. But I know you don't want to argue Israel-Palestine.
Yeah, I mean, but that's a case where it's like, I think the Palestinian perspective might resonate more if it was given more of a fair hearing. And I think the fact that it doesn't reflect.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. I mean, people just don't. The journalism does not generally illuminate a Palestinian perspective. American journalism tends not to, in my view. I don't know, for whatever reason, there tends to be more of a natural kind of cultural identification with the Israeli perspective. I mean, the Israeli situation is in a way more like the American situation, but for whatever reason, I agree.
Yeah, and look, I have my own views on what maybe Palestinians might be able to do to reach Americans more, but at the same time, I don't live under occupation, so it's easy for me to, judge and come up with ways that I think that they could be more effective.
I agree. I've been there. I mean, I've said, hey, why don't you just, hold demonstrations saying, just give us the vote. If you're going to occupy, let us vote. That would be very effective. That might really get on the news in America. It would certainly, but they have reasons that some of them don't think that that's the way to go, and so on. So, yeah.
And it's just very difficult to organize. And there's a history of when they try that gets repressed, like during the first Intifada. But again, this gets us into a conversation that we didn't plan on.
No, this would be a different kind of mindful resistance. Resistance in a different context, yeah.
Well, Robert Wright, we thank you for sharing with us your thoughts on mindful resistance. Robert Wright is a visiting professor of science and religion at Union Theological Seminary in New York City, author of several best-selling books, including his latest, which I highly recommend, Why Buddhism is True, The Science and Philosophy of Meditation and Enlightenment. Robert, thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on The Real News.